Hello everyone, today we read and comment on the 44th paragraph of the second chapter of the second book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege. Its title being, "The knowledge in war is very simple, but not, at the same time, very easy." The text follows. But although the knowledge in war is simple, that is to say directed to so few subjects and taking up those only in their final results, the art of execution is not, on that account, easy. Of the difficulties to which activity in war is subject generally, we have already spoken in the first book. We here omit those things which can only be overcome by courage, and maintain also that the activity of mind is only simple and easy in inferior stations, but increases in difficulty with increase of rank, and in the highest position, in that of commander-in-chief, is to be reckoned among the most difficult which there is for the human mind. So in this paragraph, von Clausewitz reiterates a concept that he had already expressed, actually, I think on multiple occasions, relatively to the effective simplicity, the actual simplicity of war, and in the sense, especially of in this account, talking about the theory of the art of war, specifically what needs to be known, right? The subjects that need to be addressed fundamentally, as such, for the sake of simplicity, right? But even von Clausewitz actually talked about this, even for example, in the military organization as such. I mean, there is at least a tendency to simplify what is simple, right? It can be a relative, an indication, but war tends, exactly because of the complexity of its actual enactment, as in fact we will see with power, we have just read, needs to be simplified, because there is no reason essentially to add further complications, right, more than complexity as such, because everything is complex as well. I mean, it's another relative term, but not to increase the level of complication that certain, complexity can entail at certain levels, and this is naturally inescapable. This is another physical problem. Think about the attrition factor in itself. Right, everything can start to go wrong from very, very small things to become eventually a disaster, right? So, and this happens all the time. So, that's where the simplicity is needed. Also, not to lose your mind, frankly, in the face of major chaos, as the one that in war, in fact, happens all the time. It's a sort of preservation, if you want, of yourself in the face of the fact that you perfectly know that things are gonna go bad anyway, but you have in this sense the power and or rather than the power, let's say the awareness, and therefore the, let's say, the capacity to cope, at least with the of the knowledge of that the eventuality is going to take place, right? And that's very important, especially from a moral point of view, right? Which is the single most important thing in war, as a matter of fact. So even if things go disastrously wrong, what matters is that you at least were aware that this could happen, and that therefore you're somewhat prepared to cope with morally, spiritually, and this is particularly useful in practice to really cope with those events, right? It's not just wishful thing. It really works in face of problems, so yeah, let's simply read. So the title, "The knowledge in war is very simple, but not at the same time very easy." But so here he writes in the text, "But although the knowledge in war is simple, that is to say directed to so few subjects, and taking up those only in their final results," very important, "the art of execution is not, on that account, easy." Right, so here there's a split, essentially, between things you have to address, you have to take into account, let's say, what the execution practically is, right? So you should seek for this simplicity, right, when you are going to eventually execute what you're doing. So you should, first of all, direct your attention towards the essentials, and hopefully what you're able to understand as the single most important elements in there, right? There is a hierarchy of things that matter more than others, right? So here, that's where you have to, you need to have a great also synthesis capability, this coup d'oeil that von Clausewitz basically brings on the table when there is a matter of saying, how can you cope with the fact you can't rationally sort out everything is going on. Well, you need this sort of sixth sense, right, that really exists though, and that scientifically we could scope in the objective ability of human mind of coping with problems without and effectively with problems, at least of a certain fairly limited degree of complexity, but can be definitely useful. Now we will touch this issue now. Looking at the parallel in military hierarchy and the various responsibility, and I don't know where I was going with this, but I mean that can make you essentially respond immediately to that threat, right? There is a sort of habit that you get. It seems human brain, when he's confronted with, so I don't know, you start driving for the first time, until you don't find someone who comes out from a street that you didn't expect and you almost risk to crash into. Your brain fundamentally, you do know rationally speaking that can happen, but until it doesn't happen, you don't know what it means. Now, what it seems is our brain actually memorizes that independently from what we do rationally speaking, right? Because it's designed to remain impressed in that way, and therefore next time that will happen, you will automatically touch brakes, for example. And you don't need to think that. It's as if it was an automatic machine, right? It's always us, it's always about our consciousness and perception, but at a certain time this fares at on levels that you can't really track with your reason yourself, right? And naturally here the thing is a bit more complicated, because as I was saying now, and as you remember from the text that we have read, things differ fundamentally on the basis of the simplicity of the task you are entrusted with. So, right, this immediacy, this almost instinctivity, it's a matter of guts, you would say, is very useful for the common soldier, right? Because he is exposed to certain threats that are albeit very risky. They're in this sense kind of more evident, and they're kind of more easy to interpret in a certain sense. Things change when the thing gets fairly theoretical, or at least where you don't have like an immediate exposure to actually the thing that should have been made a synthesis of already in order to frame, meaning what? That a general doesn't need to take into account, I don't know, how many grenades are exploding on a front line in that moment to take a measure to move his divisions, right? It's very important to understand the difficulty and the gap that there is at the higher levels in order to really picture what is going on in the field. That's why all the information that at those levels is needed is usually much more concise and limited and simplified in this regard than the one, say, a soldier may have to learn, right? After all, yes, there are many factors that should be taken into account, much more on a front line than in front of a single trench, right, in front of a soldier. But at the same time, there is a hierarchy of knowledge that at that point has to have been filtered already, and that's why the hierarchy functions too in the intermediate ranks as well. I mean, several, a company, a brigade, division commander must know what the hell is going on. Each and every one at their level of competence. There's a very strict, I mean, of course, yeah, there is a bit of flexibility, meaning that, especially at the command of certain unit sizes, that you can switch easily to kind of lower or higher ranks depending on the situation. But that helps as well, because paradoxically this same ability to frame knowledge in a kind of a more practical sense mostly derives from the coup d'oeil and the guts, as you could say. So it's a very complicated process, but that astonishingly, from a human like from a social point of view, let's put it in this way, actually, and also from a political point of view, hence military, functions pretty damn well, right? It's not that civilizations were built bricks by bricks, calculating every single thing. Things happen, and humans find ways to make it work, and it's as if they were programmed, aside from their rationale, to at least to be predisposed to learning that way, and to take action, however, and at least modeling this capacity also on the mistakes that they do. Like, we tend to avoid mistakes generally, even before we acknowledge that that they could happen, right? If there is a risk, you don't start thinking literally everything can happen. We can think about the worst of it, but at the same time, that's also a bit of an abstraction, and you know that there are, and that's also very important to understand how that will happen, which you can't calculate most of the time. So, in a certain sense, we're already programmed to deal with the unknown in an incredibly efficient way by ourselves, right? The thing gets complicated naturally when the system becomes begins to be very large, and you don't even have the capacity without a sound experience of years and years of experience of studies, etc., to realize, right? So that's why commanders-in-chief are something different from the soldier, right? Because they can be less exposed directly to threat and immediacy, but aside from what can happen for them too, eventually the point is that they have a much greater responsibility for their action than the average soldier does. And it's kind of a paradox. This has nothing to do with diminishing the soldier's utility in this regard. Everybody's necessary here, and the system couldn't work without all of these pieces, right? But at the same time, if you take from a single individual's capacity, what is required to the officer, to commander-in-chief in the specific situation is the highest you find compared to all its other. Then, of course, there can be someone who takes action, who understands things better independently from the rank, right? Maybe sorts things out better and even obtains victory through that. But that's another thing. Here we're talking about the theory of it, like how the thing should work. Or better, it does work most of the times in reality, right? And then there are exceptions, and that's why it's a theoretical model, and that's what we need them to. And that's, of course, what von Clausewitz also realized. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. So, the other important thing von Clausewitz stated here was that of the few subjects that should be taken into account for taking action, we also have to essentially look at their final results, right? So we have essentially to take out, in other words, let's say, all what has been the process that brought there. In the moment, we have to use what we have at the moment, right? It's not that we don't have to be aware of what just happened, why we got in that situation, but at the same time, what strictly pertains to the art of the execution is what you have concretely formed at your disposal. You must know how that works, but you don't care how it's been forged. Like, this is relatively to the armed forces as such, right? You don't need to know how these guys were fed. Like, when you have to deal with logistics, you will know maybe that. But in the moment of the way you actually wage war, as such, for theory of the art of war, you don't need, that's another thing. Like, you need that, but it's separated from it. It has nothing to do conceptually to do with that, right? This is important because, albeit kind of a theoretical distinction and something that we immediately understand is blurred in reality, because you obviously have to know even during combat how to feed your soldiers at one point. But it's still important because it makes clarity about what you have to do, what pertains combat proper, and instead for what it pertains to, in that case, supplying the troops, right? And so not thinking about the unnecessary in the specifics of the situation that requires instead another type of thinking, right, in decision making. Now, I know it sounds abstract, it's abstract in this regard, but it's still important when you are delineating, like here, what really the art of war per se is, right? Then we all know, that von Clausewitz included, of course, that we have to take the two things in account contemporarily, but still being able to distinguish them in theory, right? And the art of execution is not easy at all, right? All the preparation is a race for simplification, if you want. What happens in war is definitely never easy, right? And we have seen this. In the first book especially, we have listed basically all the factors that arrive to complicate the story at the point you can't even say, yeah, but we should give up. We can't know basically almost anything about what will happen exactly. But paradoxically, we don't need to know that, right? Because if we knew that, we wouldn't be even the humans we are, right? So we constantly do that all the time. It's just that we got so used to that we don't rationalize the fact that this is how we operate, and we tend to abstract in the face of major complications like the ones war can present, by starting to cope with to consider things in a way that diverts from reality, when it's the other way around we should make, and therefore concentrating on the toughest part, exactly the one that discourages further speculation, theorization, because it's a mess, it's the messiest thing, and that's why paradoxically the theory of war has been born, right, to go past around it rather than actually solve it. The point von Clausewitz makes, you can't solve that, but also you can't avoid that. So if you can't avoid that, you should be aware of those things that can really make a difference, albeit the action you'll have to take is, at that point, is just on you, and your talent and your capabilities, etc. And in fact, here von Clausewitz writes, of the difficulties to which activity in war is subject generally, we have already spoken in the first book. We have just said it. Then, we here omit those things which can only be overcome by courage, and maintain also that the activity of mind is only simple and easy in inferior stations, but increases in difficulty with increase of rank, right? And in the highest position, in that of commander-in-chief, is to be reckoned among the most difficult which there is for human mind. Okay, so let's frame the first part. So here von Clausewitz is saying, okay, we have seen essentially how messed up this is, and how we can't effectively solve scientifically the problem of war, the system of war as such. And here, that we're talking about the theory of the art of war proper, we need also to omit those things which can only be overcome by courage. What does this mean exactly? Well, the concept here is that courage can't fundamentally be I can't say it can't be taught, because that's also what part of training is about, but let's say is something you have to find within yourself, in therefore in psychological and partly psychophysical. That's also what makes you more or less courageous at the end of the day. Picture that you only know, right, I can't say nobody can once again can teach you how to be courageous in front of I don't know, machine gun fire. You can learn that, right? It's tough, but you can. The problem is that the resources that you will take from to do that, it can't be fundamentally framed like in a not even in a theory, right? You should go to a psychologist to a psychiatrist to understand how that effectively works, whether it works for you or not, right? There are people who can't do that, for example, no matter what. We're all different psychologically speaking, but tendentially we do know that we can't send millions of people to, against machine guns. We have already done it. We are humans in the same exact way, so that's something we can't do, and we can't do dramatically easily, right? It's not easy because we're stupid. It's easy because we have reasons to do that, which is another thing, which is often forgotten in the equation, right? We don't get to get killed. We don't go to get killed for fun, even though it seems like, it just seems a crazy person can send you to do that. No, that there are huge masses that fundamentally bring themselves in that regard. Yeah, maybe under the guidance of a single person, but you do need the mass, the spirits of these masses to go on. This is also what von Clausewitz stresses powerfully, and that's why I think von Clausewitz is dramatically ethical person, because he perfectly realizes the full responsibility every single individual bears, even in front of, even if you're obliged to do something, you're never fully obliged until you're dead, fundamentally, right? If you think something is wrong, because you're going to kill people you already know are innocent, at that point you're essentially valuing your life more than theirs, right? So I'm nobody to judge in this sense what it feels like, because I never thought of myself in this situation, albeit I think it does happen to everyone indirectly to cause such things by certain measures, even if in a less dramatic, less evident way. But we do, even things we buy in a supermarket can make the difference. But it's still you who has taken that decision, and still bears the responsibility of it. And maybe it's not that good, let me tell you. And that's how a lot of things, historically speaking, happen, keep happening, and will always happen, right? So, once again, what can you do with that? Well, we know that we can't do excessively much aside from, of course, politics and our education, whatever. We can't do a lot theoretically, but we do know that humans can work like that pretty easily, and there are reasons now we can't digress into, but it's exactly by realizing these possibility that we have to be concrete about it, right? We have to be concrete about, I don't know, reflect, for example, on how scary it is to think to go to war and risk your life, right? And you would think every sensible person would say, I'm out of there, right? So that every reasonable person wouldn't do that. Well, if you thought like that, you had to admit that the world basically couldn't exist in the way we know, because instead we do this constantly, all the time. And that's where most people tend to say, oh, well, just because they are evil people. No, it has nothing to do with that. And we know that. We know that people reasoning in this way went to war. And it came out of that. Having committed sometimes the worst atrocities and realizing, what, you would have done that too if you had been there. Because we know that there are certain things, certain triggers in our mind that get on, that are activated in certain conditions, and those things happen, right? So, and it's actually very easy to bring human beings to do those things. So never think you are the one who can't. As we often say, I think we are programmed, basically, given, I think, the extreme situations, to be able, in every situation, in every moment in our life, to potentially get to kill a person in 3 seconds. Like, there are certain triggers that we were there to happen, to operate on us, would make us kill, like from previous cold blood, in 3 seconds, a person. and that's not cultural. Uh, that depends on nothing but on our biological structure, and it's scary. But that's the difference between a person who tells you the fairy tale that it's cultural, that because you're evil, that's because humanity are monsters, and a person like von Clausewitz that simply tells you, look, this is like it is. So just be aware of that, because you're the only one who can prevent that, even though we know that that can happen. So it's a bit of a paradox, because it seems as if there is no choice. Instead, there is choice. There are actions that can prevent that rationally, right? And that's why war is usually not the best option in most situations. Definitely, violence in itself is not the best, but you may find yourself even in the need of using that for good, telling the truth, including saving people from others that can, So now I'm digressing once again, but this realization that courage is somewhat taken outside of the account it's largely because I think von Clausewitz wants to stress how certain motivations are in fact so deep and so diverse that, albeit there is a psychology of a military psychology, let's say, and of the masses, of collectivity, whatever you want to call it, that we know operates in a certain way. At the same time, that's still beyond the instrument of violence in itself, right? You can recur to it, but it's like you're smashing that person's face with your hand, but what's really going on there is in your head, right? So what pushes you at least to do it, right? Then the technique, and this is what von Clausewitz is interested in, how basically this happens rather than why it happens, is what he cares about, right? But the actual enactment, not the technique as such, excuse me. But I hope these concepts are clear, because it's really a subtle difference, but it needs to be stressed every time. So I know I sound kind of pedant all the time, but it's necessary. So here, courage aside, we maintain that the activity of mind is only simple and easy in inferior stations, but increases difficulty with increasing rank. So we have talked a lot about this topic already in this video, actually, and also in previous ones. We realize now what it means, right? Soldier has to deal paradoxically not with less strains, on the contrary, but especially from a this is also a bit difficult to frame, because the strains can be very, very heavy, even for someone who's not on the field, that commands a distance, but on a longer run. Obviously, the soldier is exposed to the most direct form of violence as such, but not excessively the responsibility that comes from it. The measure, at least in general, does, right? It's not that it's not mind-blowing to kill a person in front of you, but it's you decide the fate of one person. There are people who decide fate of thousands, of even of millions. So how do you think it's that, right? And we do know, and this is why von Clausewitz is such a refined observer, that when we tend to, that the famous Stalin's quote, like that a single death and a tragedy in millions is a statistic, sound like, well, after all, it's that easy to kill people without remorse, right? This seems not to be true. Like, you can't do it if you have certain psychological problems, if you're a psychopath, if you don't feel. The psychopaths are also maybe something different, because psychopaths do not actually recognize their kin's emotions when they see them in their face, right? That's usually they don't even understand what's the deal at that point. But other people really do bear this enormous responsibility, and we are programmed to do that as well, because we have a social responsibility after all. We do feel bad, about having killed all these people. And I don't know, don't ask me now at a psychological level if this happens, because you still feel the fact someone could take revenge of that because you feel the burden, but it does happen, right? So that pressure can be overwhelming sometimes, even more than being under a bombardment. Even if it usually doesn't feel like it, right? It usually doesn't look like it. Usually we feel that voice at the top has it always easier, that they are able to get away even with mistakes. It is not true. It is not true. Look, I don't know, think about Churchill after Gallipoli, for example. Think of, I mean, of all responsibilities that really destroying yourself at a level you feel an enormous amount of guilt. This is the real feeling, the feeling of being guilty, responsible for your mistakes that made a lot of people die. But what von Clausewitz here means is that the amount of knowledge you need in order to do things at a soldier level is simple and easy, right? Already a company commander has a dramatically more complicated and overwhelming task. A soldier can be stressed out, but doesn't have to think about much after all, in terms of executing what he has to do, right? And that's why also courage, in fact, is more necessary to the lower ranks, more easily useful to the lower ranks for doing what they have to do, because they do not have further responsibility. Once you have cleared that machine gun nest, you're done for. You can't be, traumatized for the rest of your life, but at least you've done it without particular amount of intellectual refinement or capacities, right? You just do that, and it turns out that at that point, in fact, more than reason, there are certain pre-gressed conditions that really have to do with emotions more than else than actual reason, right? Even the way you see other people, or what seems the reason. Something I've read at one point, that many recipients of particular prestigious medals were either psychopaths or orphans that had to raise their siblings without parents, right? And don't ask me now what is this the case. It seems that a psychopath at that point is, of course, he doesn't care to kill, because killing a person or not doesn't matter. He can't be scared about bullets and flag, but killing a person doesn't bother him. So it's that easy, because it turns out most humans, when they find each other in front of each other, they can't kill each other, right? They usually start firing in general, but they have difficulties at pulling the trigger when they find another human being in front of them. Psychopaths don't. So in certain ways, they're very good at this job. Others instead have this sort of kind of familiar attachment. That is to say, okay, I know what it means to raise my family, my brothers, right? And when that happens with brothers in arms in your unit, where there is obviously a splinter corps, etc., when you find someone that is aggressing your siblings in this regard, you get triggered in a way that you're able to butcher people down in a blink of an eye. And we know it happens, and I don't know the technicalities of it, but it seems it's a real thing. And I don't think that obviously killers are limited in war just to these categories, but it seems that these ones are kind of some of the top at least, psychological profiles for achieving certain results, right? These are things we started to learn actually fairly late. Like, I think up to World War II, nobody had realized that most soldiers, for example, didn't shoot at the enemy in combat. And that's why we train soldiers today, in fact, to kill people like with a conditioned reflex, right? Not even to simulate, I don't know, with silhouettes, etc. Having a mechanic, because if the human stopped thinking about started thinking about what he's doing, and ponderate on it, well, that would create problems in the effectiveness of it all. So that's also why probably even certain traumas are kind of more even so, because you basically kill a person before you're even able to understand you did. which must be a very tough realization afterwards, and we do know we feel that guilt, right? So that's also why I think war is so largely dramatic, and especially at the emotional level. Naturally, there are physical impacts at the same time, that can't get erased. Like you don't get through certain things as if nothing happened, right? Even not getting exhausted for a prolonged time, well, that causes long-term, I think, inability proper. We know a soldier today, we normally can't fight more, I think, than 40 days in his entire military career, like, because that is the maximum, after which it's the performance starts to decline. We also found this out during World War II. There were seasoned battle veterans that at one point they underperformed because they had ran out of batteries, let's say, of human batteries, and fresh records did even better than them in certain contexts. But this maybe was another digression. They didn't have much to do with the story, but it still tells you how brutal and non-intellectual that job is, right? When you start rising through the ranks, even a few, right, you immediately realize how this changes and how much you have to think rationally to take a choice, and coldly, in a way that von Clausewitz has made all of these logical profiles to tell you, well, you must be cold-blooded, but also you have to have this ability to follow. I mean, you have to be there are various combinations that make a person efficient in a command position that need to be very equilibrated in this regard. But the more the position rises, this is the most important thing. Well, this is reckoned by von Clausewitz as among the most difficult which there is for the human mind, right? It's really a difficulty for the human mind, right? It's brutal in the same way, if not more, because it's not just a matter of pure rationale, right? If I don't sort this problem out, I'm dead. You also have lots of other pressure coming at you, even if you're not directly exposed to enemy fire, for example, that way you're simply sitting behind a desk somewhere, wherever the headquarters are. So, this is the concept in itself, and it's very simple, as you understand. We have already seen it many times, but it's important to stress, to emphasize how this difference is true, simply for the fact that there are lots of prejudices, really widespread prejudices in this regard towards the essentially detachment of leaders, of commanders, specifically from the difficulties, the hardships of the common soldiers. This is not true, right? This is not true, which doesn't mean that nobody makes mistakes, but it means simply that on average, who is at the top is the person who was suited, better suited at least for the job, and that also is because it has a capacity to bear that, right? And of course you can't say, well, yeah, but there are people maybe are there because they are just someone's favorites, they're left unpunished for certain mistakes, etc. Well, yes, but this is another thing. This has not to do with the military itself. This has to do more with politics in the military, which does exist, right? It has to do even with society overall. It depends. This happens at the same time, but it's not typical over the structure of the armed forces. Like, you can't take all the world's armed forces and seeing, what's the one that is the worst. Let's say the most corrupted, for example, and the most efficient, the most meritocratic, the most competent, right? And you'll see there is a variation in this regard, but what we will see is that the structure in itself is always the same, and that tendentially who's at the top is, on average, is the more competent than others. And also that is something we have seen in also in the previous paragraph, but in others, that there are people who were very competent just at one level of the military hierarchy. You could be a terrific platoon commander, but you could suck as a regiment commander, right? We all have an optimum in this regard. It would be interesting to test, but frankly, I'm not very interested. I don't know personally. I don't think I would be a terrifically capable, I don't know, even company commander. I think I wouldn't. I don't know why. I haven't never tested myself. Maybe I've acquired some minimal idea of how the picture is, but that's what in fact normally military men already have, and way better than I can at this point, and that therefore that doesn't count. But it's it just takes to sort things out. There are people who look very unmilitary in character, but kind of military genius, right? We have all this idea of martiality, etc., but there is a great variety. There are lots of combinations, and there are lots of people that for the most different reasons actually become very efficient commanders, each one however in their own habit. And in fact it does happen. Maybe a person rises through the ranks up to the post that they are kind of better suited for, then when they're promoted they're not so good anymore because they were better where they were. In fact, there is a great confusion in this regard also when there are these things you read on the internet, like who was the best general. They don't even differentiate whether we're talking about a theater commander, division commander, company. There are massive differences between all these things, and you can't really if you don't have this dimension of the problem, chances are you in fact you're not particularly apt to the thing in itself, or at least that you lack military education in that regard, which is but these really are the first steps. So it's not that there is this enormous pride in saying I know that, or it's very simple. It ends there. I should expand way more on that in order to understand its further essentials. But all this, I don't like the ranking without contextualization, and therefore you read that like the greatest commanders ever. You have to take into account as if you could switch them in every context, right? In every scenario. Well, no, you can't do that, and you should understand at that point even the limits of a person that maybe are not great limits. I mean, if you care about especially the person, humanly speaking, you have to realize also what the limits of this person are, right? We all have, and much more than we think. But sometimes we need to believe that there is someone who is better than all the others, and therefore we have to follow them as our hero, etc. I personally never had this kind of approach. I mean, had a lot of characters that I like. That are kind of more sympathetic, others that are kind of more antipathetic, but never had to create an idol for what ultimately to say, that's my thing. The way around, like this happens unfortunately at so many levels. Even in terms of same military history broadly, think about what was the best country in history for war. What does it even mean? It doesn't make any sense. And even if you really wanted to start from a standard, well, there's an enormous lack of orientation in general about this topic. So it's impressive. But if here there is this enormous amount of people, essentially of my generation, I must say, that grew old. Like proving this kind of attitude. Just go on every YouTube video that deals minimally, with conflicts, at least conflicts that were kind of better known, like usually World War II, but even the first one, or even current wars, actually, not conflicts, but it's all about, it seems like talking about football, right? It's without any context, without any criterion of judgment, of evaluation, right? And it's very, very disappointing, because it's as if this, like, maybe we can't see this now, maybe on the internet, because previous generations couldn't speak about that. Hell, previous generations were literally the people who went to invade other people's countries and committing genocides and etc. So maybe they weren't better than we are, which I think it's the case, really. But at the same time, it's kind of dramatic that we have a world like this now to manage, and that we're still at this level broadly, right? That's the really depressing thing, because you realize there's not an enormous hope after all, if not in hierarchies, right? And that's why I support hierarchies, because these are on average functional, right? They suck, the world sucks in general, but still it could be way worse, and it's already a miracle that we're able to do what we can do. The only thing you can realize at that point is, okay, take the world as it is and trying to better it, but just be aware that there is a sort of functionality to what we do regularly. So that's also a good point to start from, also understanding what it is in the first place, and not blaming everything that happens someone else, when you are actually the one who has a lot of responsibilities. And never, this is probably the single most important thing you can learn, even from Clausewitz, that is not reminding you in every single situation, but is the underlying concept into Vom Kriege. There's nobody who can take you out of problems, right? But you, or better, you always have a way to determine what's going to happen, for better or worse, right? And in the range of your possibilities, you can really do way more than you think. So that's exactly when we say, oh well, but there kind of was no choice, that we kind of kill our own potential as humans, because we deal as if history was a sort of pre-orderly track that we follow for we don't know which magic. No, we effectively do change history all the time. It's just that it's not so apparent, because yeah, there are things that are much bigger than us, but we often don't understand that they're also very fluid, and you can't really have an impact in them after all, and or influence them in an unpredictable way, right? And that's exactly the whole deal, the unpredictability. The first thing Von Clausewitz essentially tells you, right? You don't know most of the times, the majority of what the hell is going on by the slightest, right? It's not that you know that it's going on, but you don't quite understand it. It's that you literally do not know what's happening. Like, you can't even prefigure that. So it's obvious that this calls for a dramatic individual commitment in the thing, to stay alert, right? And the Vom Kriege definitely shows you how effective this is, right? And because we are programmed to cope with relative things, right? We are not we are not set on absolutes, right? We have this span in everything, even in, I don't know, things we can hear, the frequencies. We are set on that, and we are limited in that way fundamentally. We don't understand the concept of infinite. That's the limit of our mathematics, essentially. We don't know what's that, but we still live, and we still make something out of it, and we do improve absolutely in this regard as well. So it means that after all, this is not so bad as it seems. Like, life is dramatic. It's very tough objectively. It's something that requires so many resources that run out unavoidably until the unescapable, but still there is a difference we can make. And that's what I think we should all try to do at that point, right? Given that our options are limited for real and in absolute, right? Why don't we try to make it better out of them? And that's the challenge, right? And the more you want to do, the more it becomes difficult. but it's like that. And alright, well, today stop here. And for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.